Welcome to part 2, issue 2 of The Odd Times. Let's talk about writing. I am Nick. I am one of the panel people on this panel discussion. I'm a panel person. And this is the world building crash course that I kind of off-topped the other night when I came back from work. And so I thought maybe a good intro would be a discussion about what makes for world building. And I think with our previous video, we started diving into that a little bit and deciding that certainly character names in some aspects falls pretty intricately under that umbrella. And, you know, particularly the context and where those names can originate from. But basically, as far as I can tell, world building is this act of fleshing out the setting for any story that you're telling. And it's an integral part of story building or story telling. Mm-hmm. And but some authors certainly don't focus on it as much. If I would say authors that tend to focus on it, they tend to write more, obviously, because they have more to develop. Like you'll see young adult fiction has almost no world building. Usually a real world.
I would say the opposite these days after Harry Potter and Hunger Games and Divergence. And yes, that used to be true.
Yeah.
For young adult fiction that's set in the real world or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that's where you're finding the real speculative fiction these days, and that's what changes that equation a little bit.
I think you're absolutely right in that. That was not a well thought out point at all.
No, it was for a few years ago.
Like when I was a kid, this was true. Which was it's
good. Another good example is American television, sitcoms and stuff. They don't build the world at all.
Right. They borrow the world.
You put a couch and a TV in a room, and it's just a generic backdrop.
And let your characters run around and bump into said things and each other and other characters that happen to wander on set. So with world building, I feel like it can be kind of split up into different categories of like type of world. You have entirely created worlds that are just generated from some author somewhere, usually from the sum of their experiences, which in a roundabout way, is all based in the real world. So grain of salt on that.
And imagination.
And imagination, but I mean, yeah, it's removed, definitely.
Whoever wrote the Phantom Tool Booth, clearly those were not direct experiences. Did you guys ever read that? We had to read it when I was in school.
No.
It was one of those I really recommend it. It's a great story. It's one of those allegorical stories. Like, he goes into the land of letters and the land of numbers, and he has a watchdog that ticks that keeps him company, and, places you have to eat your own words. Literally, nice. When you sit down to eat, you just say a bunch of things, and that's what you have to eat. It was very
sounds
different
delicious.
Kind of world.
Yeah.
My own words are amazing. Unless I'm driving. Unless I'm driving or doing something that is difficult and frustrating. And then I definitely don't want to eat those words.
Yeah, he tried some dry speech giving.
Shit.
And then his words were very dry and tasteless. Be on YouTube. Be on the internet.
Oh. Aw, that's adorable. Hey, Drew.
All right, can you settle down now?
No.
Apparently no. Sonic Attack. I thought the whole Sonic Attack thing in D&D made no sense till I had this dog. But it will literally stun you and make your ears bleed.
Yeah.
Right.
So another type of world you have is a partially created world where people, borrow or, just sort of elaborate on events that happened, or they take legends and sort of build on that. Real world stuff, ancient history, they build on that.
Would that include things like alternate histories?
I would say so, yeah. That was definitely in my mind when I was writing that. Like when you take a key turning point in history and make it go the other way. It's a pretty common subgenre these days, which is used for both good and evil, probably.
Yes.
That makes me think of, I read a book recently called The Song of Achilles, and it was the story of Achilles during the Trojan War, well, and his childhood, but told from a different perspective than the classical myth. It was told from the perspective of his friend Patroclus. And so it was a story that's a story in the real world, but it took a different viewpoint. And so it gave a lot of creative license in that aspect.
Yeah.
So I would say that would be a partially created world. It's a story a lot of people know, but with a different twist on it.
Or like,
and a new perspective.
Another example would be The Man in the High Castle. Which is a show that's on Prime, I think, where World War II went the other way, and basically the Nazis invaded and took over the U.S. And
oh wow!
I think it was based on a Philip K. Dick thing, so it starts getting definitely more sci-fi without any spoilers. Sort of like there's more going on. It's an interesting show. I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Would something like The Walking Dead fall into that category where it's the modern world, but then something
I think so.
unrealistic happens, so it's all the references are there, but then a zombie apocalypse happens.
Yeah.
Or would that count as, let's see, I see what you have written down next, real world with created layers.
That's what I was thinking.
I was thinking
that.
Urban fantasy to me would definitely be real world with created layers. Like you've got the normal everyday, we go to McDonald's and drive whatever's, and that's just like our world, as close as you can get it, but there's this whole other world underneath that with magic and elves.
I almost feel like partially it would fall under like a zombie apocalypse would be under partially created, because it doesn't, like, in my concept of real world and created layers was they still work together. And so when you have a zombie apocalypse, it just obliterates the old world and creates
a really good point.
New world.
Because I think that is the difference. Because urban fantasy is they're layers that interact. They're both there. Whereas alternate history or zombie apocalypse that's not our world. It's a totally different world that has some similarities. That would be my guess anyway.
Right. That's what I was thinking when I wrote down the subject. But I was also like, there's a number of, like, Hellraiser too. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It was a Clive Barker movie.
I think I read the graphic novel once in like junior high.
Yeah. It was okay. I mean, it's fairly like old and dated at this point, but you have this puzzle box.
So are we.
You have this puzzle box that opens a portal to another reality, and from there you get a lot of intrigue and interesting things going on. Sorry, there's a dog creating audio pollution with a toy. So stuff like that. Basically, a lot of horror would fall under this, and also a lot of stories.
Under which one? Partially created or real world with layers?
Real world with created layers. Like anything where you have, like, it very much also depends on the scope of your story. So like that's really the defining point between some partially created world where it's like an elaboration of the real world, or like a fictionalized real world, or you get
So actually, this just hit me. Maybe it's partially created worlds are our world with some things changed, often dramatically, like in a zombie apocalypse. Whereas a real world with created layers is our world with other things added.
That's a good way of differentiating. Yeah, absolutely.
That makes
sense.
Yeah.
Because I could tell they were obviously separate categories. Like, just looking at them, it was figuring out where the lines were. Yeah. Because I'd never thought about them that way before. That was a really good way to break them down.
I can't say I had either before I sat down. Like, this was
love it when that happens.
Yeah, I know. This whole document was entirely like, I did it in an hour, and I hadn't really ever considered it. And so it kind of surprised me that it came out.
Sometimes that's when it works the best, because your conscious mind isn't stopping you. You're just doing it fast. Like Shaft of Destiny. The reason it has that title is because I spent less than an hour coming up with the entire basis for that story, so I refused to give the title more than 30 seconds.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
But it ended up being the only one I've finished all the way, and one of the ones I really love, and I think it's in some ways because you do it fast and dirty.
Well, there's something to be said for maintaining momentum, and
also not self-censoring.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can always, that's what the editing process is for, you can always cut things out later.
Or add things.
But I mean, better yet, if you can get it all out in one go.
Yeah.
So we have entirely created worlds, partially created worlds, real world with created layers. What about things like historical fiction, which are just stories that probably didn't happen set in the real world completely?
Actually, speaking of that, what about modern stories set in the modern world? I think you still have to do some world building as an author, even if it is meant to be 100% our current right now world.
There was kind of... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done.
Okay, there was kind of a calculation when I wrote this, which was fiction is separate from trying to write something historical. And in fiction, you do more active world building, whereas there should be a defining line between world building in the fictional sense and doing research, and then also the authoristic sort of need to create agency for your reader to understand what the world was like. It's very similar to world building, but it's not creative. It's interpretive.
Honestly, I can see,
or it is creative.
Especially what we were saying earlier, what I was saying earlier about fanfic feeling like writing historical fiction, is it would be an interesting discussion all on its own to look at how world building, meaning the creation of an imaginary world, even if it looks like ours, and research how they bump into each other
commingle,
in that process. Because I think that's a complex subject.
Yeah. I know I personally...
It's pretty similar.
I know I personally have had experience doing a lot of world building and then writing stories where I do little to no what I would consider world building. When I'm writing my D&D campaign, that's 100% ground up world building. I draw the map, I name the places, I figure out who the people are.
Yeah.
But when I'm writing, say, like a novel type story, I like to set them in the real world. I'll add things. I'll do the real world with created layers thing and partially created worlds, but I mostly like to keep that set in the real world and very much ground it in that and try to make it feel realistic. And even with those, I need to do a smidge of world building because, like, I wasn't alive in Gold Rush era San Francisco. I have to kind of assume, like, make up a few things that feel right and feel accurate, but may not be. And so I think...
Sorry, continue.
Oh, I was going to say, so I think world building to an extent you always have to do, but it depends on how much towards the fantasy made-up aspect you go. You just have to do more or less depending on your setting, I think. But either way, you have to set the stage and let your reader know what world they're in.
Right.
But, I think that world building is, I think, like your last thing here where it says the setting, your actual main character. I think all fiction requires some world building. Since I mostly write fantasy, I had one really weird experience around world building. I was living in Nevada and I was writing my kind of zombie apocalypse story, and it was nano, so I was writing fast, and I'm like, so I'm just going to set it in my house, in my neighborhood, like in my town. And it was interesting because it was the very first time I tried to write a story based on a real place, but I was like in that place, and it added levels of realism that I hadn't even ever thought about before. And then I went up and visited a friend the week before Thanksgiving to help her clean for her big family thing, and stayed there for like 3 days, and she does nano too, so we were both writing pretty much anytime we weren't cleaning. And after 3 days of intense writing, during which I was writing an action scene that took place inside the house and then through the front door out to the cars. And so I'm driving back from my friend's house, and I pull into my neighborhood, and I'm coming down my street, and it had been a really intense scene to write, and very specific since I knew the place well, and it was actually like seeing Vic double. Like, I was driving down my street in the normal world, and there was a part of me that was looking for ghouls. Like, it looked weird that there were still people out and about instead of just dying horribly. Like, because it was also the setting of my story. It was a very odd.
Yeah, I bet it was. I was just thinking about it. Like, at first I was like, that's so cool, because, you're proceeding with this awareness of what you've written. But that's also kind of freaky, because you're proceeding with this awareness of something that's fictional, but you're not quite... There's no connection between fictional and reality at that point. It's just like, this happened here. So I could see
Yeah.
that as an argument to, like, never
And
write about it.
honestly, you just summed up my emotional reaction in the car pretty well, which was, this is awesome. Oh, this is kind of scary.
Yeah. Like, maybe I should go get checked out right now.
Maybe I need a refresher course in what is reality.
Yeah, right? I mean, yeah, that's a cautionary tale, right?
Right? Seriously. It makes me think of a little while back when you were talking about when you had gone on a day trip to where they filmed Twin Peaks.
Oh, that's cool.
And what a trip it
Yeah.
was to see it.
Oh, it was.
Modern, like in the same but different, and
Like the cafe is identical. It is.
Yeah.
In fact, it's smaller than it looks on TV. They did some magic with camera angles because you can barely turn around in that thing.
Wow.
But, and they had a picture in the back of the cafe of a picture of a scene from the TV show that took place in the cafe.
Oh
Which
wow!
was a very kind of Inception moment
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
standing. But yeah, Twin Peaks, if you go kind of take the tour, the other thing is the police station it's now a place where they give racing lessons, car racing.
Oh,
They have the actual Twin Peaks sheriff's truck in the parking lot for this place.
wow!
I don't know how they got it or why it's parked there. I have pictures, it's got the logo and everything. But if you are standing in front of the police station and you just turn around, that's the smokestacks. That in the TV show are like totally the other side of town.
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was weird.
That's
It's weird.
Yeah, that's an interesting example of world building with a real world place, but making it look totally different.
Ew.
Which
And a lot of TV shows do that. Like Torchwood was set in Cardiff.
that's what I was
Yeah.
just gonna say. Yeah.
And anybody who was from Cardiff was like, their geography makes no sense. Like,
Right.
like they turn a corner and are like 10 miles away in a different part of the city. I think there is always world building.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think the closest you can get to not needing world building is like we were talking about earlier with TV sitcoms.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering what I was thinking on my second header, which I thought actually your experience dovetailed nicely with. Why bother to create a world? Well, if you're having weird flashbacks, that's a good reason.
Yeah.
My first header is "Don't bother," which I assume is a reference to actually the created layers. But even then, maybe it was "Don't bother, go write
Right.
something
I mean,
historical,
there
go
are
write
a lot of times-
biography."
I mean, there's two approaches. That one is from like a functional standpoint. When I was setting my story in the house I was living in, I was kind of like, "Don't bother world building."
Yeah.
Oh,
It was already built for me. I could literally
Yeah.
like go stand where I wanted my character to be and see what their escape routes were
that
if I wanted to.
that actually could have that main idea you had there could have been a factor in me saying that too. Like, don't bother, go write fan fiction, because that's
Right.
that's exactly how I started. And frankly, if world building is holding you up, like,
Right.
you should
Then don't.
don't world build.
Or like
Yeah.
the story I'm editing right now, I green screened largely through the first draft. I have the sketches of world. I have kind of the bones of it, but I didn't really do any world building because I came up with the idea on the 3rd of November. So on the edit, I'm going back and I'm doing a lot of the world building
Yeah.
at that point.
That's a really great term that you used, green screened.
Yeah.
That captures it perfectly.
Yeah.
Just sketch it out and like
Yep. Two talking heads and figure out the background later.
storyboard.
Depending on what your story is, that I don't think that that's unreasonable.
No, not at all.
Mm-mm.
I mean,
Except that if you take it too far, it can get really boring. Like that's been
true.
one of my problems with writing lately. Is it's details that make them stories and not ideas.
right.
And I saw a movie recently that it does this shorthand thing, like to such an extent that it literally could be about 500 different stories, and it felt very generic.
Right.
So if you do that too much green screening, even as a writer, you kind of lose the thread of the actual story you're telling, and
Right.
it becomes a little too ideas, it's too conceptualized and not real enough.
Yeah. I know.
So I'm only saying that because that's something I'm trying to turn around.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, on the like, why bother creating a world thing? I think so most of my stories are set in the real world, but in different time periods. I have one that's Gold Rush era, one that's more modern. And yes, doing something in history requires a lot more research, because if you're gonna have a historical fiction, you need it to be consistent and make sense and be accurate. But it is easier to to do a story that's set in the now time. Like, this is where I live, this is when I live, this is what I know. It comes the easiest. I don't have to worry about the vernacular. I don't have to worry about coming up with these creative names. I don't have to worry about, all these different things.
I don't have to try and think, how long does it take them to drive to the store? Like, details like that you don't even think about until you're in the scene. You just know already.
Yeah. So I think in those aspects, having a partially created world or a real world that you just add layers to is nice for that reason.
There's always a reference point.
Yeah, it is not as much work. If you're creating your world from the ground up, then you need to know who says what when, who's where, what's the vernacular, what's different, and keep all of that straight all the time. And
real world stuff's easier for your reader too.
Yeah.
Because this is world building for writing, but also for RPGs, like we've mentioned already.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I sat down and played Werewolf instead of Dungeons and Dragons, and like my character went in a convenience store to buy something, and there were milk cartons with my picture on it because my character was underage, and like it was that sort of like that. Deep and complex a detail is not something you can easily get in a fantasy setting without like 15 chapters of explanation leading up to it.
Yeah.
But it was seamless in a modern setting. Like, I didn't even have to, like, the GM didn't even have to tell me what having someone's picture on a milk carton meant.
Yeah.
Like, but imagine translating that into a fantasy context where
you're
like
pages.
Yeah.
Pages of development.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Or so much internal dialogue where the character's like, I remembered that when someone's picture was on a milk carton, it meant this from my childhood. And it'd take a lot more exposition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it also, we kind of go back to the dangers of shorthand there too, because you're assuming a cultural knowledge on the part of your reader that matches your cultural knowledge.
Right.
Which mostly with published books in America has been American writers for American audiences, similar backgrounds, there's enough commonality. But I remember the first time I read a Russian fantasy novel when I was late childhood, and it was a made-up world. It was completely world-built, but it referenced totally different ideas and concepts and kind of commonly shared knowledge, and it felt really weird to read it. Like, it was very almost disturbing as a kid to have reality shifted that much from what I considered normal.
That makes me think of like the things not translating culturally, going back to Harry Potter briefly, like, the whole Tom Riddle name, like, rearrange the letters thing. I heard when that book was translated into Spanish, his middle name had to be Elvis for that to work.
Oh. Oh, that's awesome.
Because otherwise it would just translate to the English. And then the same thing with Game of Thrones with Hodor. After the fact, people were like, that doesn't work for any other language. Why that's his name. And so it kind of was this, like, interesting plot point that didn't translate at all.
Yeah.
Into different languages.
There's the whole don't bother aspect of world building where,
It's easier.
Yeah, it's easier. But I think one of the main points of creating a world or defining whether or not you do should be, does it offer what your story needs to be what you want it to be? So you're, in creating a world and doing some good world building, you're creating agency for your story to be told in a way that's interesting and, perhaps relevant.
One of the reasons I write speculative fiction is because if you change absolutely everything that's familiar, what you are left with is the essence of what it is to be human. You take people and give them tentacles and put them on an alien planet with green liquid sky. In order for it to be a story with meaning for you and for the reader, it still captures the human experience. But the reason I say that is, like, the feminist science fiction of the 70s, like Ursula K. Le Guin, is she wrote stories in the middle of feminism trying to take over in the US about gender. And because she wrote them as science fiction, people could approach that topic without all the weight of the current, at the time, conflict that was unfolding.
Right.
So you could have a guy who went to a planet where there was no gender. People changed gender regularly, and he had a companion that he went with this entire time and thought of as male because that was the human default, who ended up pregnant, even though he also identified as male because their gender was fluctuating. And she could write this in such a way that people could approach the concept of gender and think about it without going into knee-jerk reactions based on all the connotations
Yeah.
in the real world.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, approaching hard topics from a... It reminds me of when people go, my friend is having this problem. Because
Asking for a friend.
Because you get enough distance that it makes a hard topic easier to talk about.
Right. And if you have a book that's about the conflict between a blue people and a gold people, I have a specific book in mind, ironically, then you don't get caught up in, for example, the specific history of racial conflict in America between people of European descent and people of African descent.
Right.
You can approach the topic of racism from some new angles.
A neutral perspective, maybe.
A neutral perspective, an objective perspective, maybe. I mean, as much as anyone can.
Yeah.
Or also you can just explore different things because you're not talking about two human races that aren't all that different, honestly.
Right.
And what that translates to is whether or not your reader is getting distracted, right? I mean, because the main point of your story is the story itself, and though there might be themes that can be applied to anything, you know, if it's fiction, of course, there might be things, it's not, you know, yeah.
That actually reminds me, I think themes should never be figured out by the author. In fact, my poetry teacher at university said specifically that the writer was the very last person you should ever ask what their poem meant, because they will always be wrong, which I thought was an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
The meaning, I feel, should kind of be unconscious on the point of the author, or you're just writing a moral fable. Like, in which case, you might as well write an essay. You'll be more convincing.
I mean, I think that speaks a lot to writing being art. And you have different types of art, but you often hear people describe art as it's anything that makes you feel something, or things like that. And it's often more about what the person viewing it, or in this case, reading it, perceives than necessarily what the author or artist meant. But
I'm gonna have to.
I think that's what. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to offer a dissenting opinion on this one. I think just because I think of, especially if you start looking at films too. So let's classify them as writers for a sec.
They are. Anyway.
So, oh God, what's his name? Stupid. If Stanley Kubrick had not been thinking of the theme of like space age growth and human enlightenment and stuff, would we have gotten 2001?
Okay.
If let's talk about musicians. If Roger Waters or David Gilmour, I don't remember who wrote it, had not been thinking of, this is a weird roundabout one too, Animal Farm, would we have gotten Animals, which is a great album.
Yeah. It's a great song. But so here's what I feel. I think having a theme in mind is not necessarily a bad thing. I misspoke earlier. Having a answer in mind, when like this story is going to be about how love conquers all. I mean, we all start to write that story, let's face it. But like if that's what you're sitting down to write, you're rarely going to tell a story that is compelling. But if you sit down and like this story is about love, if it's an exploration, then I think that does not leave the same fingerprints of moralisticness across the manuscript. And I think that's where things like created worlds can be useful, because if you sit down to write a book about racism and it's set in modern America, you have a very specific thing you as a writer are drawing from.
Right.
And if you decide to sit down and write about racism with blue people and gold people, you will find the story going places that you wouldn't expect because they don't match up with reality. And you as a writer might learn more about your theme too, from angles you didn't predict.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I've done writing before where I know what the story is, and I know that I'm telling this story of this and this happening to these specific characters, but I'll then go back and edit it, and then I go, oh, this is what this is really about. This is really a story about sacrificing for people or overcoming a negative family history or something, some deeper meaning that was not my intention.
Right.
Absolutely.
And then
I think they show up better if you don't know about them until the edit.
Yes.
Personally.
Yeah. So I think knowing what your story is obviously important, but sometimes people find different themes and different meaning in your story than you intended, and I think those are just as valid and sometimes more profound than if you'd intentionally tried to methodically insert them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, have you ever had the experience, I can't think of a specific right now, but it's happened a couple times, where you saw or read or heard something that had really profound meaning, emotional meaning for you personally. You're like, this is like the deepest thing ever. And then you hear an interview with the person who wrote it, and they're like, I don't know, I think it's kind of stupid. I was thinking about my dog's doing this thing. And I'm like, okay, I hate you forever now, and also screw you for messing up such a profound song.
Yeah, if it were, say, we'll use the example, if you're talking about racism in modern America, and you said it in modern America, people are going to come in with preconceptions and their own thoughts, and they're going to be ready to be like, you're wrong, or that's racist, or whatever. But yeah, if you have this world, people aren't going to come into this alien world and be like, you're wrong, that's not how that conflict started.
Like, everybody knows that blue people are better. That shouldn't even have to be explained.
Yeah, so it cuts out a lot of the bias. That
you haven't watched Rick and Morty yet, have you?
Mm-mm.
You should. There's a great episode where the target nipple people are fighting the cone nipple people.
Mm-hmm. And then someone yells race war at one point, so they're very like,
hey.
You know.
He says, I have 4 pod for your podcast.
A podcast? Rhyme.
Podcast.
A podcast.
So we can all agree, I guess, that world building is pretty important, especially to fiction writing, and to contextualizing things, etc., etc. So a big question, I'm sure, on the minds of many would be, how do I do this? And how do I create a world? And, there's a few notes that I had that I wanted to touch up on. The first header is kind of weird, but I wrote, make it up and apply plot stitches later. And
I liked that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I know what I meant, and that's basically like, if you have an idea for a world and it comes to you naturally, and it's something that seems like you could go a long way with, just write it out, and then put your characters in that world and figure out your plot, and then it's all going to come together anyway, but be sure to get that world as developed as you need to. And
that is an ongoing question, at least for me, after practically every scene of, do I need to stop and do more world building now?
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is, again, we've said this before on this very podcast, you can always edit, later.
Yes.
You can't always get those thoughts back once you dismiss them.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite quotes is, you can edit anything except a blank page.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very important, even just to barrel forward with it. And
yeah, I would say absolutely. I agree that always err on the side of forward momentum.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if you have to stop and world build, that will become apparent fairly quickly when you're halfway through the scene going, I haven't written a word in 2 hours and I have no idea what they eat for breakfast.
No.
Guess what you need to do?
Well, and what I think, okay. So I'm going to save my current thought for a later header that we've got here.
Okay.
But basically that is a way you can do it, and I think it's a good one, because you end up with a very fleshed out world that your characters can then operate within, and you can, you have all that data. I think the second header is a little bit redundant, based on what we've already covered, but I wrote rewrite history, and so, I think that's an easy way to do it as well. It's not demanding a lot of your reader, and So I mean, it's there. You can certainly create a world by rewriting history, and it sort of just writes itself at that point if you know what you're looking at very, very well. Which would actually, there's a lot that would go into it, including doing the research and making sure that, your historical points were at least accurate in the sense that, unless, you're having aliens come down in the ancient, times or something, and, like, basically you want your world based on facts somewhat if you're rewriting history. Like, you don't want high technology folks in the ancient past unless that is your story.
Unless there's a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you're like, I'm setting my story in ancient Egypt, but there's also TVs for no apparent reason.
Right, and no other technology. Not even electricity, just TVs.
Yeah.
I mean, side note though, there are some interesting ancient hieroglyphs of things like helicopters and like airplanes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And there is a rumor that the pyramids were alien spaceships.
There is. That's the Stargate theory.
Yes. So this was a book that I read really recently.
It
was Shadows.
I think.
Sorry.
No, I was
really.
Yeah, go ahead.
On a world building point of view, I recently read a book called Shadows by Robin McKinley, which was a really good book. I love her as an author. She does fantastic stuff. It was written in 2013, and it is set in an alternate universe. And it was interesting from a world-building standpoint because it overlapped with our world in weird ways that were never fully, like, it was not presented as it made sense. So this was New World, which was where the main character lived, which looked essentially like modern suburban America. Everything was exactly the same, except people knew about magic because it was illegal. They had the gene spliced a couple generations ago, and now they have anti-Kobe boxes everywhere that monitor for magic. And they have, like, pocket phones, which are the same as our cell phones, but not quite the same as our cell phones. And by calling them pocket phones, she just, like, created this whole shorthand for this is kind of what cell phones do, but they're different.
Yeah.
And then there was Old World, which was largely like, you think it was Europe. Like, they actually had European countries and things, but it was a, like, still medieval fantasy version of Europe. And then there was the South Worlds, which they never actually talked about in the story other than by name. And then the Far Worlds, which was, I believe, Asia, because one of their characters was half Japanese and he was from the Far Worlds. So it was a weird mix of, like, alternate history and urban fantasy and she never tried to make the pieces all fit together, but they worked for the story. Also, the main character was like a 16-year-old girl, so she wasn't thinking that hard about the world she was in.
Oh, right.
Makes me think of how they're proceeding with Westworld on HBO.
I mean, that's a good example of a totally created world within the real world, but
so it's more like a real world created layers.
Real world? Yeah, it's like a real world, but then something not real happens, and they make a world that's not real but looks real.
Spoiler alert!
And that is the premise. It's not a spoiler.
Yeah.
Well, and that actually brings up a question for me, which is, where does magical realism fit into this? Because we're talking a lot about the fiction we're most used to here in America, and magical realism I only finally started to maybe catch a glimpse of because of a semester or two of literature at university taught in Spanish. And it is the real world, and something magical happens that's thematic and is never explained or justified in any way. Is often what determines magical realism. Like, trying to think of some specific examples, and I don't have any off the top of my head. There are people much better versed on this topic than I am.
I think it sounds.
But you could have Sorry.
Well, I think it sounds kind of like real world created layers, but I don't know. So it changes the entire world when it happens, or just like one aspect of it,
or does it change nothing and just happen and people
just happens and
I've seen all of those. It does not. World building.
What about?
Like I said, these are largely literary stories, and the magical things that happen make perfect sense from a literary thematic perspective.
Right.
And whether or not the people in the story even notice that they're magical depends largely on the story.
So is it sort of? Oh, hello. Is it like a? How would an epically impossible coincidence fall under the realm of magical realism?
I think it would depend on how it's handled.
Okay.
Like what? Like, give me an example. Sorry, hard question.
I mean, I feel like I barely know what the genre is. I think your expression right now was the first I'd heard of it. So.
Okay, so I decided to go to Wikipedia and look up magical realism since I'm doing a terrible job of distilling it down.
Thank you.
It is a style of fiction that paints a realistic view of the modern world while also adding magical elements. It often refers to fiction and literature in particular with magic or the supernatural presented in an otherwise real-world or mundane setting, which makes it sound like urban fantasy, but it's nothing like urban fantasy.
Right.
And I can't put it into words better than that.
So it would just be like
a
normal story set in a normal world, except for that angels are real. And someone's like
Supernatural would be a
No, that's
no, not really.
Oh.
Because that's the supernatural is the point. It's not just like I'm thinking more subtle, like a story where someone says, "When I was a young child, an angel appeared to me and told me this is going to happen," and everyone's like, "Wow, that's crazy!"
That
and then they just
reminds me of a movie.
Accept it as it totally happened, even though it, you know.
And there was one that I read that I believe that she had an actual worm in her brain that was doing things. The character, and she knew it was there and it was a real thing, and like everyone knew about it, but it was also like scientifically impossible. But nobody was like, "Oh my gosh, this is scientifically impossible." They're just like, "You have a worm in your brain."
It's weird.
Like
Ratatouille.
So almost like acceptance of weird facts that couldn't actually be as normal.
Yes,
Without
and they are accepted as normal by
it.
Normal people in a normal world who never go, "Wait, that's magical." They're just like, "This is a thing."
James and the Giant Peach. Or
no, that's bug people.
No, because that's more like the Phantom Tollbooth.
Oh.
Almost.
Isn't James the Giant Peach like a voyage and return type story? Doesn't he go into this magical world and then come back out of it, or is it all set in a real world?
Yeah, it's very similar to Up in its story.
That's what I thought.
But I don't remember about what you're saying, whether or not... I don't think he goes into a magical world.
The Peach itself was a magical world, but I don't remember if they went anywhere.
But there were big bug people. Were there big bug people in his everyday life?
Yeah, I think they were just, like, part of the world. But I don't remember that story.
In some ways, that does actually share... In some ways, that actually does sound like it shares quite a bit with magical realism. In that it's bizarre and it makes no sense, but...
The metamorphosis.
People are just like yes, Metamorphosis is actually a very good example of magical realism. Though it was not written under that name, it's considered science fiction.
Yeah.
But he turned into a giant bug, and neither him nor anyone else spent any part of the story going, "Wait, people can't turn into giant bugs." They just engage with "I am a giant bug" on a really thematic level.
Did you ever see that movie with what's the guy's name? He played the evil captain in these Into Darkness. Peter Weller. It was a Peter Weller movie where it was maybe based on a Philip K. Dick thing too, where he's an exterminator and he lives off of rat poison or something and starts like losing his mind. And does that sound vaguely familiar?
That sounds vaguely familiar to me, but I don't know why.
Where. The rat poison, I guess, not killing you would be the magical realism element, because I think it just makes him hallucinate and write crazy things, if I remember correctly, and then he has to eat the... I don't remember that well enough to talk about it either. I wish I knew what it was.
And that's my problem too. Magical realism is definitely a subset of the literary genre, which has never been something I've been super familiar with.
Right.
Found the definition. However, in contrast with its use in literature, magic realist art does not often include overtly fantastic or magical content, but rather looks at the mundane through a hyper-realistic and often mysterious lens. Which I think goes back to what Clara said about in Supernatural, the supernatural is the point.
Right.
Whereas in magical realism, the supernatural is only there to illustrate the point.
Right.
To kind of bring it into hyper focus. It's like metaphor times 100.
Gotcha.
That's exactly what I meant.
American Gods. Magical realism.
So I was thinking about, I listened to a fiction podcast recently that I loved called Alice Isn't Dead. And I don't know if I'd classify that as urban fantasy or magical realism. Or supernatural horror, which is not like either of the other two.
Right.
But has a lot of similarities.
I mean, good authors kind of straddle the genres anyway. Yeah. I feel like I've never read a story that was pure genre and felt like it was wholly satisfying. Like I've read a lot of fantasy, and I've read a lot of pure genre stuff, science fiction. I always want something more. I never sit down and, I don't know, like it's...
I like myself some brain candy.
Yeah,
sometimes.
Yeah, of course. Of course. But, like, it doesn't satisfy in the way that something that's that sort of straddles all, like an omni story. Like,
I kind of feel the same way about music. Like, good musicians are very, very good at their genre, but great musicians are good at a lot of genres.
Whatever genre, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's something to be said for that, for sure.
I'd like to bring us to, like, a little bit more, like, actual practical discussion right now, because I have some tools that I use for world building. Cool. Many of them I've found online. The one that works best for me personally, because there are others that are just as good, but they just don't bring anything up for me, is something called Fantasy World Building Questions by Patricia C. Reed, who is a fantastic author, by the way. This is copyright 1996, but she actually, it's just a list of questions. It is 32 pages long in a Word document. Nice. Which is crazy. 32 pages That's of huge. Sections and questions. And it has a section on, like, physics. Is this on an Earth? What planet is this on? Is it on Earth? Is it on an alternate year Earth? Is it on a fantasy world where you never think about the universe? Is this a planet somewhere? What's the size of the planet? What's the gravity like? What is the sunlight like? Stuff like that. And she doesn't have really an intro on how to use it, but what I do is I just kind of read through and I answer the questions that make sense for that story, because you don't need all of them. You don't need to know how religion works if your character is never going to interact with religion. Right. For example, things like that. I've found others that were specific for science fiction writers that do go into great detail on physics and astronomy and faster than light travel and things like that. But there are some really great lists out there. And another one of my favorite things I love to do is draw maps. Orson Scott Card taught me that. He says he draws maps in pen because if he messes up, that just becomes a new
feature
detail in the world. He said he drew a city map once and he realized he'd put 5 gates in and then covered one of the gates completely with buildings. Which he had not planned to do. He had just forgotten it was there. And he said that created an entire story all of its own, because why did the city wall up one gate and pretend it never existed? And it turned out it was some cult from, like, the past. And I thought that was cool, that just a pen stroke can create an entire universe sometimes.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Do you have any tools that you use when you develop?
Okay, so it really depends. When I write a story, I like real world settings. Often historical, some more modern, but in that case, I do a lot of research. I'll maybe watch a movie or a documentary or something to really get the flavor of that era and that place. So if I'm doing that kind of story, those are the tools that I use, really. Research, documentaries, movies, shows that are set in that, anything to get the flavor, the dialect, all that. If I'm doing, say, my D&D campaign, that's not the same at all. And so for that, I have... And granted, that's a very different kind of storytelling. And that is almost entirely just world building. And then the players kind of write the meat of the story. Yeah. And so with that, I made a map. People kind of fleshed out the basic idea of how the story could go if everyone went that way. And then, like I say, I use some references from the real world. So if I was doing a place that was more Japanese feel, I would do a little bit of research and come up with some Japanese sounding names or things that were relevant or descriptions of things. So I don't know. My biggest tool is largely just research, but I've never been a super big sci-fi, totally different planet type of fan. Not that I don't like them, but that's never been my preference. And as far as reading, watching movies, or writing, I'm just not. I think it's really, because of the world building, very easy to do things like science fiction badly. I don't want to read a book where I'm having to read 3 pages of schematics and information about how a spaceship works and what the solar system is. I don't want to do that. I don't care.
Though, ironically, one of the authors who is most infamous for doing that does not write SF at all, and that's Tom Clancy, who used to literally spend like 7 pages on like submarine blueprints and how technology worked. I didn't read much of him, but I remember everybody complaining about that because he wrote like a hard SF writer, only it was modern and real and spy stuff. But yeah, I've always had issues with that. Like, I really don't care how the tech works. Like,
I want it to make sense. Like, if your ship can go light speed, then don't have that be inconsistent.
Don't hide it until the moment the characters need it, for example.
Or if it,
Deus Ex Machina, here we go.
So, like, I want there to be a consistency and an internal logical consistency, but do I need to know every detail of that internal logical consistency? No. The author should know it.
I think that's a different Latin phrase when that happens.
But I don't necessarily need it all laid out. So I think in some ways, world building, when you get down to the minutia of how does the water cycle work on this planet, sometimes just the author needs to really know all the details.
Absolutely.
Well, the point is, if someone thinks about it, it has to make sense, right? It's not necessarily about like, let's go water the model, or model the water cycle.
Thing. Yeah.
Water the model cycle.
That's it.
Well, yes, those model cycles don't grow if you don't water them.
No, exactly. You got to feed them and make sure they're happy and talk to them.
But I mean, I think I may have told you guys this already once, I don't remember, but I read this once as advice for historical fiction, and I loved it. And they said basically what you have to do is like research, like bury yourself in the research, like spend years researching whatever you have to do until it's like real for you, and then totally ignore it for at least a year, and then write your story without ever looking at your notes. Because you want it internalized, but internalized in such a way that you don't have to stop and show off to the reader that you know that crazy little detail.
Yes.
I actually think this conversation has led to our follow-on point, or our back to our document, if I may. So the next header on here is, when do I create a world? And I think that was really the question in my mind. How do you balance these needs, the agency of the story, with actually setting it in a way that doesn't seem weird? So the first thing that occurred to me, you're doing it all the time. If you're writing fiction or hybrid, you're creating it no matter what.
I would say even DMing. There are probably things that come up in session that create world building as it goes.
Oh yeah.
Oh, definitely, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and I think with writing or D&D, especially D&D, but also with writing, I think once you have your world established, don't be afraid to improvise a little bit. If your character is going to do something unexpected and they're like, this, I'm going to do this, and you're like, wait, is that possible? Unless there's some hard and fast reason why it's not, let it happen.
Yeah.
And explain it later, if need be.
I mean, I agree with some of that. I do think that by necessity, a lot more world building happens to occur on the front end of a story.
Oh, yeah.
So, just in dropping the characters into the story, you have to write a bunch of exposition for it to make sense as to why they are where they are right now. I mean, you don't have to, but it helps.
It helps. I did something recently for the edit that I'm working on that I found really to be an interesting world building exercise. So it's in a fantasy world that's totally made up, and I'm trying to get it, like I said, it's green screen, so I'm trying to get a lot more detail, and a lot of what's taking my time is world building on the second draft.
Yeah.
And I just sat down and I decided to sketch, not map, but sketch the inside of my character's cottage. Because there was all these gaps that when I was thinking about describing the cottage, even in detail, my brain could just gloss over, like, whole corners or something. But when you're sketching, you're like, there can't be a big blank spot in the middle of the cottage. And it makes you think about, where does this bed, how do beds work in this world? Like, they're
where does it
modern
have
beds.
To go?
Yeah. Right, and I decided to put it in a little nook in the wall, kind of like the Viking style beds where they were kind of closets.
Oh yeah.
For warmth, and because his cottage is tiny. And so then I'm like, so what does he do in there? Because I know we're humans. Like, we're not like, time for bed. I'm gonna go to bed. Okay, I'm asleep. Like, it very rarely works that way. So I sketched in like some bookshelves, and I said, hey, he's a mage, so he's got like a glowstone, so it won't catch shit on fire when he's in his little nook with his curtains, but he can like read and stuff. That never would have occurred to me if I was writing the story, because I never am going to need him to go to bed and read. Like, that's not something that has to happen for the plot.
Right.
But now I know it's there, and it can be throwaway details. But because it makes sense in the background, those throwaway details should add up to something that feels like a real place more.
Well, definitely, and like it's not a waste, because if he does, like, your story is going to go places where you're not sure, you know.
And this is book one of a series, so he may end up back at his cottage in a future book, where some of these weird things I drew on the shelves that I don't know what they are suddenly important plot points.
Yeah, and I mean, it enhances the readability and believability of it at that point, you know, when it's used. And if not, it sheds some details about the character. Born reader, you know, may have a bookshelf there as well, or somewhere nearby where he can grab another volume if he runs out. You know, often sleep deprived.
Like, he doesn't like mornings, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and just like we were talking about, you know, having something set in the modern world, like in even a location you're currently at, that feels easy and more natural because you know all the details and the minutia. If you create a world and have those details and minutia even just in your own head, I think that'll make those stories flow better, because at least you're familiar with the setting and it won't feel as forced or choppy or odd.
Right. I mean, I will say my two favorite things in world building as a reader are, I want a world that feels bigger than what I can see. I want a world that feels like it extends well past the edge of the page. One good example of that for me is the Firefly Serenity universe. You see very little of it, but you have this sense that it is huge and vast and has all this stuff going on that you don't know about.
Yeah.
And I also like, ironically, I like worlds that feel like characters of their own. And that's hard to put. I can't think of any specific examples. Actually, most zombie stories, Walking Dead, like, the world itself is a character.
Yes.
Because it is the antagonist. It's not any one zombie that's the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the whole world of zombies. And in every zombie apocalypse movie or story, you end up spending a lot of time telling the reader the specific details of your zombie apocalypse world. Like, do headshots work, or do you have to decapitate? Or
do they run? Do they not run?
The world itself shapes the story and is a character and feels alive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a good way when it comes to zombie stories.
Right. The two stories that I think of the most on that particular topic would be Alice in Wonderland and The Labyrinth.
Ooh, yes, and also Neverending Story.
Yes.
If you ever saw that.
Yeah. Those very much have a world that is very recognizable and specific, and the story's not the same. And I think a lot of those two are examples of the voyage and return archetype, where it's a separate world. So that person interacting, I think in those kind of situations too, that gives you a little bit of an out. You can have a character that feels familiar and has familiar mannerisms and familiar reactions, but a world that is totally different. And
that's something you see a lot in fiction, especially like television. Like, we'll bring up Torchwood again, because Gwen in Torchwood was the in character. She was the normal person. She was the one who didn't know anything about aliens. And there's almost always one of those characters.
Yes.
And it gives your average viewer, it's more common in TV than books, I think, because the average fantasy reader is like, I can totally empathize with an alien. I don't understand what you're like. I don't really need an in character. I've been doing this since I was 3.
Right.
So it gives the viewer someone they allegedly can identify with, because it's all strange and new. But it also gives someone that they can explain stuff to, so that it's not all just exposition.
Right.
So you can be like, oh no, this works this way, and they actually have an in-story reason to do that.
Yes.
Which is why I almost never like those characters, because they are almost always just doing stupid stuff all the time that makes no sense.
Yeah.
To kind of prove where the edges of the world are and where things start to break.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and once you get immersed in the world, especially with the TV show or a movie, once you're immersed in the world, you're just like, catch up. Why aren't you? Then you're not at that place anymore where that person is, and you're just like, ugh, he's so annoying. But
Right? But apparently non-SF fans
Jeez.
don't have that same experience quite, because there were quite a few long arguments on the internet about Gwen and Torchwood, because like half the people hated her because of that exact same reaction. Like by episode 2, we're caught up and we're like, cool, aliens, rift, technology, awesome, we want to hear more about this, and she's still like, is this a spanner?
Yeah.
But there was also this other side of fandom that had not really come as much from the science fiction side, who loved her like the entire time because she was still like them, I guess.
Right? That makes
I thought
sense.
that was interesting that people reacted differently.
In the past, you know, so much money went to the printing of these things, and publishing houses ruled everything, and it was a demand that that books sell a fair amount of copies, and doing like an important part of that, along with TV shows, actually, is being relevant to the audience. And yeah, I think that's a trend in thought that is actually maybe even detrimental to storytelling, but it's certainly a factor.
I agree.
I agree.
I mean, I've noticed most television shows have a main character who has no personality at all.
They're
one
just
of
a
the best
blank
examples,
slate for whatever you want to impose on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A good example is Lost. Like, there were so many really, like, almost caricature characters on that. And then you had the allegedly main guy who I cannot tell you a single thing about him except he liked to tell other people what to do. Like, and he was some sort of angsty doctor, but he had no personality at
Leader
all.
man. He's the leader man. He will tell us what to do, and he's a doctor, so that's why.
Right? And honestly, Walking Dead, the first season or two,
Yeah,
I felt
Rick.
the same way.
Yeah.
He was very much everyman.
Well, and
I read an article once about the difference between sentiment and sentimentality, which was a fascinating topic, but it had to do with that, with genericism, basically. They said genres where sentimentality is preferred, it's because of identification issues. And they said romance is a really good example. These are not usually individuals. These are very bland archetypes. You usually have the alpha male and the spunky female, or like, you know, they change with the times. But, and she said, the person who wrote the article, I don't know if they were male or female, said that's so that there's no detail that will interfere with the reader identifying with that person.
That makes sense.
They're not like, oh my gosh, this person likes mushrooms. I hate mushrooms. I can't be this person.
right.
Yeah.
Which is apparently an issue readers have that like I said, I'm like, I can totally identify with an alien from like 3 on, because that's just what I grew up with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you see that a lot in TV. I can think of a lot of shows. Like, the one that comes to mind the most is Sex and the City. People would be like, you're such a Samantha. You're such a whoever.
Sex and the City.
Point being that sometimes people like someone to be a little more general so that they can identify with you. You're that type.
Don't send it to me.
And I think with some things like The Walking Dead, Rick starts out more generic and then changes so that people can go, yeah, I would do that in that situation. Or, what is he doing? I wouldn't do that in that situation. And, and I've heard of a few other ones where the characters are specifically left a little more bland or general or blank so that people can go, that's me. I'm there. I would totally do that.
Yeah.
It's almost like it lets you make it a fan fiction without having to do any work.
That's true. That's a really good way to look at it.
You're just like, yes, this is about me. And it's not, but it could be. And,
but it could be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and it's all about keeping that happy vibe up and going, which is great. I mean, you know, but like, I think an important thing to look at, in addition to what we've already discussed going down this rabbit hole, is you know, your readers' needs, your story's needs, and pacing your story. So, like, when you, like, there are a couple of ways to develop a story so that you feel like you are, there's, like, the page extends far beyond what you're currently being described. And the most common that I ran into early on, especially reading Tolkien and stuff, was the exposition that just goes on for days and it never ends. And it's almost like it's both the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world, because like, it's super interesting just from a lore perspective, and for the rest of the story, you know, you'll proceed with this huge expo dump and it makes everything more enriched. But
there's something to be said for getting it all out of the way at once.
Maybe, yeah, I would agree with that in a vomit draft specifically about the world, that you can then, like, okay, I'm going to put that here and here, or pare it down. But like,
well, but it's always it's such a balance, like, because you want to tell, not show. But
Yes.
then we kind of overemphasize telling, and sometimes you just want to give a short paragraph explaining the situation, and then the reader's on the same page, and everybody, it almost becomes invisible, and you just move on.
Yeah.
right.
But that easily turns into 3 pages of no thing anybody cares about.
Right.
If you don't do it well.
Yeah, I think there's a happy medium. Like
Yeah.
I love
Yeah,
Tolkien.
definitely.
I love the Lord of the Rings series. I have since I was a child. I will just skip over 3 pages of I'm explaining what a forest looks like. I'll just
Right,
straight
I
up
mean,
flip tap the end of that because I
read it
know
as a
what it
kid,
looks like.
and I love the story and stuff, but I went back after the movies came out, because I actually learned to love it a lot more after the movies came out, because it made the characters a little more human for me, which that's so backwards for me. The movie is never as good as the book.
Yeah.
But I went back and reread it, the original novels, out loud to my partner at the time, and I found that I had not noticed how long the description went on for some of these.
Oh yeah.
I remember. You remember the scene on Rohan where they're being surrounded by Eowyn and his writers, and like there's that conversation.
Mhm.
That was like 8 pages long.
Yeah.
5 at least of which had no dialogue.
Yeah.
It was like
Yeah.
waxing poetic about the yellow grass, or I don't even remember now.
Yeah.
But the other thing I noticed is that read out loud,
The glinting.
that was stunning poetry. Like his
Oh, I bet.
actual language is
Yeah.
gorgeous, and I'd been so focused on the story reading it silently that I'd never noticed that.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. Because, yeah, I when I'm in it and I'm immersed, I don't want it. If I go back and read that bit separately, I can appreciate the beauty. But when I'm in the middle of the story, it takes me out of it to read
Well, when
3
it goes on
pages of
that
this.
long, yes, absolutely.
There's some value, I think, in some overlong exposition sometimes. Like if you're introducing a very complex thing, like you have your
Right.
you have your heroes traveling to a new city that's got an entirely new way of life. Maybe it's a new culture entirely. So new setting, new culture. Long form exposition is great. And if you were to, say, continue with a character-centric perspective into this new environment, you know, it can be useful in some ways. I can see some value in that, too, because you can up some suspense. Maybe your characters don't know anything about this, too. You know, I think it elicits a different vibe when you have a brick of text describing something versus when you're sort of inlining it, you know? And it creates a more mythic vibe specifically. Like,
it can, yeah.
It creates a larger than life feeling that and due to the length of it, you're gonna remember it. Like it's a significant moment when they all get surrounded by the Rohirrim or whatever they were called.
Rohirrim. Yes.
And so like it emphasizes that, and he would do that on a regular basis. Like there were parts he did skip over, but it was like, you know, journeying through the woods when they got out of Moria. Like they didn't spend very long on that. They could have, but he sure didn't.
Yeah, they
Already
could have
had.
brought in a new Tom Bombadil.
But yeah, I mean that was no kidding.
I remembered my original point.
Oh,
Yay!
Yeah. So, you know, a lot of times when you look up writing guides, it says show, don't tell. Which I understand 100%. Sometimes I really just want a book to tell me. I don't need a long flowery explanation about how someone came into the room and they smelled this and they saw this. If it's not important, just be like he entered the room, she was standing in the corner smoking a cigarette, and he said this. Like I don't always need to be told.
Shown in great detail.
Sometimes shown is fine if it's not a detail or minutia that builds the world or tells me some important thing. A little bit, I think, is fine. But that may be an unpopular opinion. But sometimes I'm like, oh my god.
It is a matter of opinion. I think that the answer is always going to be somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. But I remember somebody pointing out that, like, say it's in a science fiction world and doorknobs don't work the same. Like, you can have people walking through doors and, like, describing in intricate detail how these, like, so, like, they put their hand out and they insert their fingers into the door and they turn it 3/4 counterclockwise. And this builds over, like, every time a character goes through a door, you find out more information about how doors are built. Or you could have a paragraph saying, doors were opened with a finger panel in the center. He walked through the door. Like, that's not good writing, but just give them the facts, tell them what's going on, because nobody cares that much about the doors. Just like,
Yes.
if there's a few facts, the character knowing or the reader knowing them will make the rest of the scene easier. Don't warp your scene into knots trying to show those facts if you can just tell them.
Yes, and that's exactly what I mean. If it's not important, but I need to know it, you know, for things to make sense later on, then it's okay to just tell me.
Yeah.
It's okay.
So,
if a forest just looks like a regular forest, but the point is that it's big, then describe
just
how it's big, but don't describe what a pine tree looks
forest.
like. Yeah.
when should I not create a world? When it doesn't serve your story, characters, themes, plot, etc. However you're writing it and cutting it up before you piece it back together and put it in a document. Yeah, don't do that.
I think it's just, in that instance, I think it's important to think about it as if you're the reader. Like, you as the author might care deeply about how an alien door works. Does your reader care?
Yeah, that's why.
Is it important to the story?
Yeah.
You know, if it's not, keep it succinct and short and...
It's punchier. It's going to be better. It's going to be punchier and better.
And see, that's not always true, because there are some stories that the language and the description of the world are the point. A lot of things by Southern U.S. writers use a very dense, rich style that builds a world without much plot movement, and people love those. It is a balance, and I think that a story that is short, punchy action and a story that is kind of long, meandering, and you're not sure if there is action, both have a place. And making a rich, slow-moving story shorter and punchier will make it a different story, not necessarily a better one.
Right.
And vice versa.
Right.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who love the long, detailed descriptions in Lord of the Rings, for example. And
there are some people whose favorite Lord of the Rings book is the Silmarillion, which doesn't have a story at all.
Oh Lord, I know. When we were talking about an info dump, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
But that wasn't an intended to be published thing either. I think it's important to note that was back shelf stuff for him that he would pop out as his own research material to make sure he wasn't fucking anything up in his canon.
Yeah, that was essentially. In fact, that's a great one to talk about on world building, because that was his world building notes.
Yeah, I think that brings up the whole first point actually that's under that header, which is within. Okay, you should not create a new world within your established canon, unless there's a point to it.
Right, unless there's a reason.
Yeah. So yeah, that means like override that would basically be you setting the rules and then putting aside the rules in order to say something inane, and then bringing the rules back in as if nothing ever happened. It's like,
wow. I think I've run into that in TV once or twice.
Oh, all the time. All the time. I think that is Deadpool's entire point, but it works for him.
Well, when it's the entire point, as we've been saying, then usually it's okay.
Yeah, usually. So I think, I mean, it's very important to maintain consistent with your canon. If you're writing, if it takes off, people are going to be more interested in it than you, and they're going to find those plot holes.
Oh, Lord.
They're going to find
they are.
all those spots where you were inconsistent, and they're going to remind you. Not only for that reason, but also the sake of your own sanity, so you don't end up doing something silly like retconning a bunch of stuff that you already did.
Well, I mean, look at just Harry Potter. How many people go, that didn't make sense because of this thing that she said happened 30 years previous. Like, people will nitpick the crap out of you if you're not consistent.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's definitely an important thing to keep consistent with whatever rules you apply, unless there's a point. Again, that disclaimer. I think this should have...
Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like this should have a subtitle like, World Building Crash Course, unless there's a point.
Yeah, I think we should just have, like, text that pops up at the bottom, asterisk, unless there's a point, like every other sentence.
Almost.
Unless that's the point.
Yeah.
Okay, so here, I have a question for you, Nick.
Okay.
So where do we draw the line between world building and setting?
I almost wouldn't. I don't think I do.
I don't think I do either, which is, I think, what I was saying earlier when I said that every story has world building, even if it looks like it doesn't, because you're still choosing what to include and describe of the real world.
Right.
To create your character setting.
Yeah, you're always world building. Again, like I think, even if you're writing historical fiction, you have to convey that, and in a very simple sense, world building is just conveying what's around the main character and the secondary characters to the reader in a way that's not that serves the reader. We'll say that.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, because what you have is you do have readers who like, a story, they like to appreciate a story that's like a lazy flowing like river, like you were saying, just something that just
meanders,
feels natural and has its exactly, meanders, grows
vaguely
in its own
story
way.
word.
Yeah. And that's got a very natural vibe to it. But yeah, you also you do get people who are wanting more of a narrative and wanting more of a plot. And so yeah.
One article that I read put it, or book I think it was, put it as basically an constant interplay in a story between scene, which is detail and showing, and summary, which is later that night after a peanut butter sandwich, like you don't always have to show him eating the peanut butter sandwich.
No.
Yeah.
One of my favorite parts of On Writing by Stephen King was he had his wife read one of his drafts. It's a great book. It's the only Stephen King book that has ever made me cry. I will be totally honest with you about that.
It was the most relatable Stephen King I've ever read.
So at one point he says, his wife comes back to him after the first draft. She goes, why does this whole middle section with him in the summer job and everything going on? Like, why is that in here? And he's like, well, it needed to happen because of this, and this. And she's like, yes, no, the character needed to have this happen, but the reader didn't need to know about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yep, exactly. Like, yes, he had to have the summer job. This all had to happen, but you could have just like skipped ahead and been like, after a summer of doing this job, he
I can remember a few years back watching a season of The Walking Dead with my brother, and they had this, like, in the middle of some intense scene, they stopped to fish and talk. And he got so annoyed. He was like, why are you wasting 10 minutes of my time showing them fishing?
Yeah.
Like, nothing's happening.
That was so
They're not
frustrating.
talking about anything important. Why is this in here?
See, that was entire season 2 of Walking Dead for me. Like, they ended up at a farmhouse and it turned into a soap opera, and there were no zombies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It was budget problems.
Well, I mean, that story, like, since about season 2, it has seemed more like it's about telling this story about a popularity contest that happens to, like, the surroundings are, well, of course, but like in that context, they were looking for leadership, supplies, in that order, like
who's doing what,
and so it became defined very early on, and it became very like narrow early on.
It's like character growth over plot advancement.
Yeah, but do you really like the characters? I mean,
I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying
the ones that are supposed to be likable. Like,
I looked up the comic book that it was based on in season 2 because I was getting to the point of like, I don't know if I care enough. Season 3.
Right.
So I went and read the comic and discovered that the basic story is man's descent into madness. Like, it was supposed to be about Rick becoming a horrible person, essentially. They said, no, it's already splitting from the comic originally. Like, and I'm like, clearly. But that was the source material, was how horrible can people get?
Yeah.
If, like, and I'm like, you know what? I don't know that I want to. I mean, I'm gonna miss Dwayne, but
honestly, that's I stopped watching, I think, right around the 8th season. It was after Terminus. It was after...
Spoiler alert, I feel like maybe necessary in the near future if you keep going.
I haven't watched it. I'm seasons behind.
Well, so. I know, but if you're going to say, I stopped watching after this thing happened, then...
I just said a name. I didn't say any specifics.
I know. That's what I said.
It wasn't even one I knew.
I stopped watching.
I knew about the governor. There was a governor.
Yeah. There was a governor. I stopped watching...
And he was the guy from... Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. What was he from?
He was the same guy who was in Blackpool, not Deadpool. Good show, by the way. Blackpool.
Check it out.
It's a dissension plot, but very well done.
That sounds vaguely familiar. Is he a cop?
No, but there is a cop who is David Tennant.
Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe I have seen that. Blackmore.
You may.
Blackmore?
No, not Blackmore.
I don't know.
It's a town in Lancashire. Lancashire? I don't remember now.
It sounds really familiar, but I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah.
At any rate, there's a certain point at which I wasn't relating to the story at all anymore, and it actually would upset me, like make me angry to watch. And it wasn't because anything that the showrunners or any of the actors did. It was, well, maybe it was. I mean, it can all be laid at their feet. The characters weren't likable. I felt an extreme disconnect from those people. Like, why would I want to watch this horrible set of circumstances turning these otherwise maybe good people into like shit shows?
Horrible.
Yeah. It felt wrong and somewhat voyeuristic and like bad, and it made me mad.
I had a similar response to Lost. I gave up on Lost after a season or two. My parents held on to the bitter end and are still indeed bitter about the bitter end.
I never actually saw it.
Me neither.
Yeah.
I got to about season 3, and I was watching them on DVD at home, and what I realized was we would spend the entire episode pissed off. Like, we made a game with ourselves. Like, if we can go an entire episode without anyone poking their nose into someone else's business that they absolutely have no reason to,
Nice.
then we can watch an episode of Firefly. So, like, a month later, we still had not seen a single episode of Firefly. So we narrowed it to, like, 10 minutes.
Wow.
We can go 10 minutes without them poking their nose into something that's not their business. And, like, 3 weeks later, we'd seen, like, 1 episode of Firefly. I'm like, obviously I just don't care about this show. How about we just watch Firefly?
Maybe that was the true theme of Lost. Maybe they wrote it thematically, like they decided, okay, everyone's lost. They have no idea what the fuck even they are doing. They're going to go into other people's business now all the time.
And tell them how to do their stuff.
Well, yeah, and because those people don't even know what they're doing, they're going to argue about it. It's natural.
Right. I think it was Hurley was one of my favorite characters, and I think there was one about the time I stopped watching where somebody's like, "You shouldn't do that," and he's like, "How is this any of your business?" And I'm like, "Oh my god, finally somebody said it!" But of course it was their business, and it turned into melodrama for the next half an hour.
Yeah. Speaking of things you shouldn't do, retcons. Don't do it unless there's a point, like a really good point for your story, like
Torchwood, where you name a memory drug retcon.
Sure.
That was the best retconning I'd seen.
That's really smart. But so the classical look it up definition of a retcon is new information comes to light that makes something that you've already done meaningless. Well, actually, but if you look it up, too, on Google, it'll say, makes a new understanding of prior events.
Really?
Yeah, so that's the new school definition. If you look it up on Google, that's what you see.
Really?
But I think, in my opinion, it's really more of the former.
Agreed.
It's not a new interpretation. It's making moot. I mean, some things you've done previously.
I've always thought of it as
it literally means retroactive continuity.
Yes.
Yeah.
The definition is, oh no, Superman has always been a woman.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
maybe he has.
I've always thought of it as rewriting.
Who cares?
So, maybe you said this happened in the past, but then you're like, oh no, it was really this, and everyone just didn't know. Or you just don't offer an explanation, and it's just, I'm totally rewritten something.
Or so a classical...
I mean, it comes from comics where they reboot the world every few years.
Yeah. Another classical example of this is like the dream, that the whole episode of a TV show that is actually a dream.
Oh yeah, the dream sequence.
I hate that shit.
I had thought of this before. This is a well-known cheat. The cliffhanger, like the old school cliffhanger, where they're literally hanging on the edge of the cliff at the end of the episode. Mm-hmm. I forget what they called this, it pissed me off as a kid too. Like, you just knew it wasn't fair. The next episode, instead of opening on them hanging on the cliff, it opened on the car 2 minutes before it goes over the cliff and shows him doing something clever.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's a weird retread retcon, I would say.
Yeah.
Like, it's a weird hybrid, because retreading is this thing, if you don't know, which I'm sure you do.
I don't.
But, okay. In a serialized or episodic show, you would take some segment from your previous episode and tack it on to the beginning of your episode just for continuity reasons.
So like a last week on.
Yeah, so the viewer can go right into it naturally not having to watch any new material. Also, this has benefit for anybody who's making an episode like this, because you get a nice little chunk of time at the beginning of your show that you don't actually have to film because you already did, right? So it's taking up a nice chunk of time. It's to a degree in the anime world that it's like hilariously bad. Like 5 minutes of retread, and then 5 minutes of, and then another 5 minutes of next time on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
great.
like
so your 20-minute show will only be like 10 minutes of new content.
And much of that is.
You know who did
stupid.
that really well that I enjoyed was the first season of Heroes, because they would retread, but instead of it just being clips from the last episode, it would be the same scenes as the last episode, but from different angles or with different stuff included.
Or the relevant threads that have gone back more than one episode. Like, that's how they started doing it. And that, I think Heroes was the first show I noticed that on. And I thought it was really clever, because that was a show where you had so many threads that it was going to be hard to keep track. And, like, you couldn't just do the last 5 minutes because all of these threads were developing in tandem. So,
especially since it was serial, meaning it was multiple storylines that were happening at the same time across the world that you were trying to keep track of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had to do like the last 5 minutes of each storyline, of which there were like 6.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just your whole show. Every show
Yeah,
is just
pretty
the
much.
same.
Guess what? We don't have to film next week.
We're
We've
good.
we got to set the scene for next week or something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've always heard of retcon as rewrite. I think going back and giving new context to something or adding a detail that makes sense but wasn't revealed before is a totally different animal.
I think that's a valid thing to do, but, like, you can't use it to diminish the struggle, like, that you've had in getting to where you're at.
Right.
Like, so there's some way to finagle it, and I don't know how, because it's a very specific thing.
Well, okay, so here's a really good example of the new definition of retcon, I guess, which I agree with Clara. To me, that's a totally separate thing, and it is a very valid narrative style, whereas retconning is a cheat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, even if it's the point is that it's a cheat. Like, the original retconning was, like, no, this has been true all along, even though we said the opposite.
Right.
But if you go check out Happen Leonard on Netflix, that's
a good show. I like that show.
That's a great show.
Yeah.
I have not seen season 2 yet, but season 1, it was recursive. Like, the actual events that took place in the real time were only part of the show, and it was interwoven with these past scenes.
Yes.
In that, I watched it again to watch season 2, and it was amazing how different all of the scenes at the beginning of the show were once you actually knew the whole story that you didn't get till all the way at the end.
I bet.
And that sounds like what they're talking about with the new definition of retcon, is something more like that, where it goes back and gives you new context and changes the way you see stuff. But that's not retconning to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's an argument for, just devil's advocating,
Okay,
for the way comic books do it. You've already scaled up too much. Like, okay, say it's something like Superman. He's OP now. We got to do something because his story is the same every week. Well, let's make him insignificant in the grander scheme of things. So suddenly he's still superpowered Superman, but he's fighting Galactus or something more like not Marvel. It's changing the expectations. That part I don't have a problem with. Refreshing the story, I guess that was more of a modern retcon, actually, my example. Yeah, your example would have been more classical, where suddenly Superman's a woman. And
always has been.
Yeah, and always was.
Yeah.
It's almost like gaslighting your readers.
I think
It's like,
it is.
Yeah.
Don't do
Because
that.
reboots are separate too. I mean, you
Yeah.
could see the entire new Star Trek franchise as a retcon, but it's not. It's an alternate universe.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And Flashpoint, DC thing that the Flash actually reset the entire universe doing something in that storyline, and now they're going through universe 5 or 6 or however many. They've gone
But
through
to me,
dozens,
that's not retconning either, because the character caused the change to happen.
Yeah, and it's a multiverse.
Yeah.
And that character still exists, I think, and is, you know...
And retconning is a messy solution, but when you have 500 authors all writing for the same character over 40 years, you gotta have something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, retconning is not, it's not like it shouldn't exist, but it is kind of specific to extended, long, serial, multi-author type situations.
I was just going to say, I think there's a really, really big difference between retconning in any sense in a comic book, which is lots of stories with different artists and different authors, and like, say, a series of novels. It feels a lot different, because I feel like if you're one author with multiple, like, novels in one story, it feels like you're changing the rules of the game, and it really, I feel like it can be unfair to the reader, because if they've gotten used to, say, an alien door that opens a certain way, and then 5 books later you're like, just kidding, it's a regular doorknob, then they're like, then why the hell?
Why did you put me through all that?
So much time?
And why in this other story was that an important thing that happened? Like, it just feels like a big middle finger to your reader. Like, it was all a dream all along. You're changing the rules of the game at the end to suit your own purposes. Right. And that's unfair to someone who's invested a lot of time and emotional energy in what you put out.
Yeah.
Like,
ultimately.
God, I read this one series once that cheated in kind of the same way. I don't remember the name of it now or the author, so I can't shame them, which is probably good.
Oh, no.
But it was like a fantasy trilogy. And you read the first book, and the first book was really good. He cheated in a couple of series. He was a really good writer, which is why it pisses me off so much when he screws it all up at the end. So you read the first book, and you got established in the story world and the characters, and you knew what was going on. And then you started the second book, and it was like the same world and the same events, but they were all slightly different with no explanation. Like, people were in totally different places. They kept referencing events that hadn't quite happened that way. It was like he'd retconned the entire first book.
Ew.
And then in the third book, he had this, like, cheesy way of tying it together, but after an entire, like, 500-page book in which I'm like, I don't know what the hell's going on or why. I kind of didn't care anymore.
Yeah,
by the time he tied it together.
Most people are going to lose interest well before that.
Yeah, and it turned out to be like something had actually changed time. Like, in the third book, you found out that, like, it, like, went back to the first plot, and then this thing happened where, like, they activated a device and it, like, rewound time and changed some things, and then proceeded again differently from that, which was a great concept, but you don't wait till the third book to show it. You just don't.
I can think of at least one Star Trek The Next Generation episode where somebody's like, wait,
I love that
like,
show.
small details are wrong. And she's like, this isn't the way this happened. You don't play the saxophone. Like, what's happening? And she's trying to tell them, and they're like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. But it's not like the whole world was just suddenly different, and they acted like it always had been different. And everybody was cool with it. And it just went on from there like it always had been different.
There was,
here's a good example of retconning
like
done. Retconning as a narrative device was Buffy, Dawn. Now, I don't know if you've watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer or if you watched it live or whatever, but I think it was season 4 or 5. She suddenly has a little sister who has never existed before, but the entire world is treating this like it's normal. She's got family photos up of them as children playing together. Her mother's like, you always take your sister with you to the mall. You don't think you can get out of it this time? Like, and you spend like 3 episodes going, what is even going on? And then it turns out she's a magical energy thing that the monks turned into the shape of a little and literally retconned the world so that everyone thought she'd always been there. But stuff started showing up, like when Buffy, I think, had a high fever or something, her sister kept zipping in and out of the photos.
Oh my god, Taz.
Like,
oh my god, watch Rick and Morty.
What?
Right now.
Okay. No, not right now. I'm in the middle of something.
I want to talk about this episode. It's so similar, and you'll probably see it when you're oh my god, you will fucking love it. Just watch it.
Okay.
Watch it.
Okay.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I bet you do.
I think
it would make great conversational material.
I think when it happens and there's a reason and the audience or the reader is in on it, then some clever retconning can be an interesting plot device, especially for something like a comedy where you often have the things don't make sense, kind of thing.
Right.
But I think
or as the speculative element.
Yeah. But say an author writes a series of books and then wants to do a prequel series of books, and they conveniently change a bunch of things about the world to write the prequel with no explanation.
Yeah.
Oh, this is convenient.
Then that
makes it so much easier. I don't even have to think anymore.
Yeah, then that's not fair to the reader.
Yeah.
Like, if you're gonna write another
feels like
story
they're
in that
breaking the contract.
world.
Yeah, there is a contract there, and you gotta respect your reader, and that's not respectful.
Yeah.
Oh, just speaking of breaking contract, another book possibly by the same author, also really good. There's only one book though, and all the like one of the main characters could see the future, but they could never say it because they literally remembered everything backwards. So if they changed the future, they became mindless because they had no memories at all at that point. This was a big deal through the whole book that he knew the future, but he couldn't talk about it. Like, he had to leave himself notes. It was a really cool device. And like in the last chapter, I think his contract from the publisher got pulled or something.
Oh, no.
Because his character's all of a sudden like, well, nothing I can do from here on out is going to change anything, so I can tell you everything now, and spends a page and a half summarizing what would have been books 2 and 3 and then ended it.
Wow.
That
works.
I mean, that might be a little too much of showing instead of
Tell, don't show.
Yeah, that's the right way. Tell it.
I mean, it's kind of cool that he snuck that in there, or the writer did. Just
if his contract was pulled, then it wasn't just him cheating.
Yeah, it had a reason.
Yeah.
Disclaimer: if there's a reason.
Well, yeah. I mean,
there's a reason. And I'm sorry, even getting as a reader, even having I didn't care. Still, I threw that book across the room so hard. I was so pissed off.
Yeah.
It was such a betrayal.
Yeah.
Well, but that's on the publisher at that point, and the author was trying to do his best. Like, hey, I don't have this platform for you anymore.
I don't want to leave you
so,
hanging.
Here's what happens.
I assume, yeah.
There was a...
Though, like I said, he has cheaty endings on a lot of his books, so...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a different thing.
I feel like a weird nerd because here's the thing. I don't watch all that much anime. It just keeps coming up. Because...
Yeah, you say that, but every time we talk, you reference at least 5 different types of anime.
Well, he's deep in it right now.
Okay, so my friend explained this to me because he's like, "Oh, you gotta watch this one called Yu Yu Hakusho," and I'm like, okay. So I tried, and it's not great. It's nothing that makes me want to watch it. And apparently, there's a section of the story where basically that happens, and they skip ahead months and months and months in the plot line. And don't explain anything, and suddenly it's almost like a very different story with like
Redo.
a very and I think that's how the manga ended. Like so, like he basically didn't finish it. Wrote a nice note, sorry everybody. The pressures of being a manga artist, on a week-to-week basis are literally fucking killing me. Sorry, never gonna finish this shit.
Wow.
Signing off. But so it happens. It's just a very sad thing usually.
Yeah.
And also a good reason to
Compassion.
avoid whips online.
Yeah.
Quips?
Works in progress.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, wouldn't you want to see them at their best anyway? I mean...
Right? Well, and I get it. Like, I had 2 friends recommend The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, I think I have that right, which is one of the best fantasies I've read in ages. It's from ages ago. Anyways, I really liked it, but only 2 books are out, and neither friend told me.
Oh.
So, and it is a trilogy. It is not a series. It is a trilogy. 1 story over 3 books. And so I get to the end of book 2, and I go online to see if the library has book 3, and I find out it is not even written yet. And I'm like, and I get that, and if I'd been warned, it would have been okay, but recommending this book series to me without telling me it's unfinished is a little bit like saying you're going to give me a puppy and then giving me a decapitated puppy corpse. Like, it is not a story until it's done.
Yeah.
I've been trying to read Game of Thrones for like 15 years or longer, so I totally relate.
Yeah.
And
have you guys watched iZombie?
No, not yet.
There's one line in there where the character's like, just ask him. He really loves Game of Thrones, so just go up to him and ask him right now, what's George R.R. Martin doing right now? The answer is always, not writing.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The only other thing is there was a header under when should I not create a world, which was during your denouement, because that's that's your ultimate moment. Don't fuck with it. Just leave it alone.
That's where the whole suddenly science fiction trope fits in.
Yes. Yeah. Like it's frustrating. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Just let the moment happen. Do it later. Do it after.
Unless it's like an epilogue that takes place later that shows how the world has changed.
Or like I mean you like epilogue magic doesn't exist in a story. Epilogue. Magic resurrects the main character. That is the Bible right there. Okay, it's fine. It works. It works. but don't fuck with your denouement. And as for conclusions, I think they can be summed up pretty much all at once. They may require additional discussion. I would welcome everybody's conclusions, but what I've got written down is world building is, number 1, an essential skill. Number 2, frequently overused. And I think if you balance them, and the way I wrote this was, oh God, there's more than I thought. Okay.
Scroll down.
It's more of a paragraph.
Okay.
Sparing your story from too much world building can return dividends in readability and story agency, or plot agency, I guess. And an established world can create emphasis and enrich plot and characters, and balance is really the key to building a good world with less sacrifice of readability for your plot.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that would just occurred to me is, one answer to the question of how much world building should I do is related to the length of the work you're creating.
Yeah.
If you are writing an 8-book series, you want a pretty detailed world.
Yes, you do.
If you're writing a short story that's 90% dialogue, you probably don't really need any.
And if it takes place in the real world, even less.
Yeah.
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 I mean, so that's huge. So that probably should have been a header of its own. And, we can do subsequent videos on this, actually, if you think of any. And if our listeners think of any,
Our fictional imaginary audience.
Yeah, send them on over to us. We'll read those email and
make suggestions in the comments.
Yeah, we'll read that one email that comes in, and we'll take it to heart and do a topic on it. So
that's right.
Why not? So what are y'all's conclusions for world building? Like, how do you see it in terms of like what's important in building a world, and I guess what's important in building a world?
It has to matter.
Something a little less broad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I think, the key for me, is it's not just window dressing. We talk about setting like it is, but it is not. If the setting is not integral to what's happening in the story, it shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Makes
some
sense.
ways.
Seems legit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. I think world building is really important, both with what you create and add, and with what you create and leave out. And a lot of it just depends on what kind of story you're telling, how long of a story you're telling, how you want it to feel. Do you want a short, punchy narrative? Do you want a long, meandering, poetic story? Like, I think world building can really add to the feel of your story. And it's just as important as a character name or what, it's an important part.
Yeah.
Of how your story is, and knowing how to make it and how to edit it are really important.
I think really the conclusion we've kind of all come to, it seems like, is do it on purpose.
Yeah.
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 Like, how much world building and what kind of world building depends a lot on your story, but be aware of what you're doing and make the right choices, even if that's on the 5th draft. I'm not saying you got to get it right on the 1st draft. You never have to get it right on the first draft.
And
never ever.
And when it comes to determining what's right, don't necessarily value anyone else's opinion. Value your own. Make sure that you think it's good.
And if somebody tells you something that you don't think is right, get other opinions.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because no one reader, that's kind of back to there's no such thing as bad writing, because it's really no one person is going to be everybody's reaction. Like, some people are going to like your story. Some people are not going to like your story. Some people are going to want a different kind of story. Get a lot of people's feedback, and that way you can tell if it's one person's reaction or if everybody is saying something along the lines of, I don't get what your character's doing here. So one key to good writing is to get a first reader who knows what your weaknesses are and is willing to ruthlessly eliminate them, and who you will thank for doing so instead of hating them.
Agreed.
Kind of like Stephen King's wife going, the reader doesn't need to know any of this.
Yes. Yeah. And what I was going to say, as far as something else that I think is important with world building and how you present it to the reader, is consistency. If your world building is short and punchy and as needed, then don't have 5 pages of a description about how some minute thing works and then go back to short and punchy. Like, if you're going to have it meandering and descriptive, keep it that way. Unless
right, don't suddenly have your climax happen with no description at all.
Yeah, unless it's like an action scene where it calls for short and punchy, keep it consistent. Keep the world description consistent unless it has to be different. You know?
Right. And if you're having a rich, meandering, detailed story, your short, punchy action scene is going to be short and punchy to a totally different standard than the one in an action story where no sentence has more than 2 clauses ever in the whole thing.
Yeah. Yep.
I think we're
out of words and things.
So that was basically my presentation and everybody's presentation. World building crash course. Didn't really have a good name for it, so that's what it is.
That's fitting.
And that's it for the Odd Times podcast today. So if you like what you hear, if you want to talk about it further, feel free to send us an email. Go ahead and like and subscribe to us on YouTube. And
leave a comment.
Yeah, leave a comment. Hit that bell if you want a reminder of when we release a new video, because they're always going to be about like this, but not necessarily on the topic of writing. And until then, have a great one. I don't know. Thanks for listening. If you did, it's pretty cool. I think so. It is what it is. Anyway.